Hello everyone, welcome to the first session of walking through the book of 1 Peter, and I'm going to try and do this a little bit differently than normal. The entire time we're studying through the book of 1 Peter, I'm going to be using Logos Bible software to walk us through it. Hopefully along the way I'll be able to show you some cool tips that maybe you didn't know before. Maybe you own Logos and just never knew these features were available. Certainly, by any means, I'm not an expert at using Logos, but I picked up a few things along the years that I've been using it. So today we're going to be starting a video study in the book of 1 Peter, and I hope, as time permits, to walk through the entire book. It's kind of a task to undertake, but I am going to attempt it, and I hope that you're able to use this to encourage your your spiritual walk in the Lord, and I hope that you are able to be edified by this, and I hope that you'll get a lot out of it. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. I pray that before you start this, that you'll just take time to stop and pray and ask God to keep you attentive. And also pray for myself that I present the word accurately. As Scripture says, that I divide the word rightly or cut it straight. Our goal here is to go through a step-by-step hermeneutical type of study process. This is our first recording, and today we're not really going to look at any of the text in particular. We're just going to look at some of the background information of the book of 1 Peter. And I'm not going to go too deep in it. I just want to get some of the basics so that as we consider the cultural background and the way or the time it was written and to whom it was written to, that as we're walking through this book and going through this book verse by verse, that we'll keep these things in mind. One of the most important things in hermeneutics is context. And if you take the scripture and the passage out of context, you lose the entire meaning. If you lose the entire meaning, your application is wrong. Or if your application is wrong, well, a whole bunch of other things go wrong. So hopefully we won't do that. Hopefully I won't let any of my own theological biases mess with the interpretation. I hope to be as true and as faithful to the word as absolutely possible. Now, with that said, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about myself, and I want to be right up front, and that way if you want to continue to join us, you can. If not, you're welcome to cut the video off at any time. I am Reformed in my theological views. That basically means that I hold a very high view of God's sovereignty, and particularly in the salvation of men. I do hold to the doctrine of election. Matter of fact, I hold to what's known as the 5 points of Calvinism. So if you want to call me a Calvinist, feel free. I don't care. I've been called worse. But anyway, that's just a little bit about me. I'm married. I have 5 children, and we attend church here in northeastern North Carolina. I try to do what I can to serve regularly. So just a little bit of information about myself. I also help run a blog over at longfortruth.com. My brother and I run that blog. My brother Danny and Danny lives in upstate New York with his wife and children. So we kind of coordinate that blog a little bit together. And we focus mainly on a lot of the false heresy and teachings you see creeping in to the church nowadays, particularly with the New Apostolic Reformation and this wacky charismatic stuff going on. So that's kind of the focus of that blog. But anyway, just a little bit about myself, just a little bit about my background. Not a whole lot going on besides me wanting to be passionate about helping people study the Word of God. And again, we do that through a method called hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is simply being able to take a passage of Scripture, interpret it accurately and correctly. Uh, we strive for exegesis rather than eisegesis, and exegesis is just a fancy way of saying we're getting something out of the text, whereas eisegesis, we're reading the text and putting our own theology and our own interpretation into it rather than what's supposed to come out of it. And we're going to try and avoid that during this study. So let's get started. The first thing you should do if you're ever going to do a book study is you want to sit down and you want to read the book through in one sitting. 1 Peter happens to be a very short book. It's 5 chapters. It's not very long at all. It'll probably take you, if you're reading it carefully, it'll probably take you a half an hour to read it. Maybe not even that long. Now my habit is to, when I'm doing a book study, is to try to take the number of chapters that the book has and read it one day, or once through a day, every day for the amount of chapters I have. Well, for 1 Peter, I try to do it every day for 7 days at least because it's such a short book, and so I extended it for a week. But on Saturdays and Sundays, when I was off work, I would read through it twice on the weekends. I would try to read through it once completely in the morning, and then once again in the afternoon. And that way, by doing this, you'll have a really firm grasp on the major thing. You'll get a really good bird's eye view of it, I guess I should say. You won't know the ins and outs of it, but you'll get a really good bird's eye view by reading it over and over and over again. And when you're reading, you have to remember, the first 1 or 2 times you want to kind of read through it to get a feel for it. But after that, you really want to start being proactive when you're reading. And what do I mean by that? Well, being proactive means you're starting to look for these connections. You're starting to look at these conjunctions that are connecting these thoughts together, the therefores and the so that's, and all these other things that are connecting paragraphs to other paragraphs and sentences to other sentences. You're looking for repeated words and themes. You're looking at the verbs to see what kind of action is being done and where the focus of the action is. You're looking for significant lists, anything that's going to help you to understand better. Now, at this point in your reading, you want to try to avoid as much as possible interpreting something, because when you first start, you're kind of not at the interpretation stage. You're just reading to get a feel for the text and to kind of get a bird's eye view of what the themes are and what all of these repeated words and other things are throughout the text. And with that in mind, that comes to our very first tip in Logos. I noticed that reading several times through 1 Peter, one of the major themes is suffering, suffering and trials. But I also noticed a couple other things too. I noticed that glory tied to suffering and trials, whether it was the glory of the final step of the believer or glory coming through the other side of the trial or whatever, but glory and suffering were kind of tied together. And I also noticed that holiness was somewhat of a big theme. It wasn't major, but a couple times Peter focused on his audience's holiness and how they could be holy in the midst of persecution, in the midst of trials. And then I also noticed several purpose clauses. A purpose clause is just something that gives a purpose or a reason for something else taking place. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of visualize what that would look like, so at a glance I could kind of see what was going on. I could just kind of scroll through and look at all the hits and see just how prevalent these themes were. Because when you're reading, you see them and you see them over and over and over again, but you don't really realize how much they are or how significant they are unless you can visually see it. And so Logos has this neat little tool called visual filters. Now, some of you may recognize visual filters, and the first thing that comes to your mind are these 3 little dots up here. And these are visual filters, but these are visual filters for the actual text. And there's several options here. For example, under resource, if I click this arrow, I can turn on corresponding selection, which if I have another panel open and I highlight a word, it will highlight the same lemma or the Greek word or whatever. But that's not the kind of visual filter that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the visual filters that you can actually create in order to see things like repeated themes. You might want to see the particular lemma of a word over and over and over again without having to keep highlighting over and over again. And so to access this feature, you want to go to your Documents tool, click Documents. You want to come all the way down here near the bottom under this menu here, and you're going to click this visual filter, and it's going to open up a new filter for you, and you're going to name it. And I happen to have that right here. This is what I did, and you can see that I named this 1Peter Thematic Elements. And since I realized that suffering and glory and holiness and all of this were thematic elements, I wanted to highlight them. And so again, trials were connected with suffering, and so what I would do was I would come over here and right click, and I would make sure that lemma here was selected, so I would select that, and then I would come up here and I would copy it. And when I went back over to my visual filter, you could see that, well, this is actually the word trials right here. This word parasimos here. And so I would make sure that the morph was checked here. That's what I wanted. And I limited it to all passages in 1 Peter. If you're studying the Gospels or maybe an entire section, maybe just a Sermon on the Mount, you can type in whatever range. Suppose you're studying the Sermon on the Mount and you just want to see all these words, a particular type of words, in Matthew 5 through 7, you would just simply hit this and you would type in your range. And then I got mine in all resources, simply because if I want to open another Bible, I want these to show up in other Bibles, in Greek text as well as English text. I could have just put top Bibles, but I just left it at all resources, or I could have just chosen the ESV, which is my preferred version. But I didn't. And I made sure that I had Logos Greek morphology. There's several Greek morphologies you have available to you. You have Freiburg, Graham Chord. If you got a high enough base package, some of you might only have Logos Greek morphology, but that's okay. I would recommend that one since Logos is the one that actually goes and tags these things. And so what I did was because trials are connected with suffering, and this is suffering right here, pasco. I just typed the word lemma and then a colon, and then I pasted the word in here, and then pasted this word here, and I gave this the red highlighter. And so I did the same thing with glory. I took the noun form doxa, and I took the verb form doxazo, and I gave this the purple highlighter. And then the same thing with sanctify, or being a saint, or being holy, hagios, which is adjective or noun, and then the verb hagiazo, and then I gave that the on fire highlight for the emphasis. And this is what you came up with when you scroll through kind of the book. You see how prevalent these themes are, and wow, you can really see suffering and glory just kind of pop out all over the place here. And so just scrolling through the book at a bird's eye view, I can see these lemmas and how, look, glory and suffering right here tied together. And again, you have suffering, but then you have glory down here, and then you have testing and glory. And then you might notice a couple of brown highlights up here. Let me scroll back up to the top to show you this. And this is what's known as the purpose clause, the hina clause. Now, I made a separate file for that, simply because it really wasn't a theme, and so I didn't want to put it under thematic elements, but I just put it under purpose clauses. Kind of made my own visual filter, and you'll notice that this looks a lot different than this here. Now, what I did in this case here was I simply did a search, opened up a search menu, and then I went back and I copied the Greek word. I knew it was hina, and I made sure that the lemma was selected, and I copied it, came over to my search, I made sure it was set for morph, and then copied it, Command V, and I put that, changed the reference to 1Peter. Change that, and then hit it to go, and you'll see that you get 13 hits. And so what I did with this was I dropped down here, and I simply did this save as a visual filter. And when I did that, I named it my visual filter. I named it Purpose Clauses in 1Peter, and I gave it a brown highlighter. And so when you look here, anything that's in this brown highlighter, there's this is, and there this is that. Henna usually marks some type of a purpose. They're not, well, I don't want to say not every time, but the majority of the times you see this, it's going to be translated as so or that, or so that, or in order that, and it marks the purpose of what's going on in the preceding clause. And so just at a bird's eye view, I get to see all of these themes just kind of jumping out at me here. I can see, the glory. I can see trials and suffering linked together. I can see the purpose for some of these things that are going on. So visual filters are a neat way to kind of isolate something that you may want to just get a glance at to see it. I hope that's a cool tip for you. I didn't know if you knew something like that. You can do pretty much visual filters for anything, almost. You can do visual filters for a particular lemma. You can do a visual filter for any type of specific, really any English word, and just about anything you can come up with. But as I did that, got all these down, and so I was able to see visually how prevalent they are throughout the text. And now with that said, we're going to kind of jump in to the background information of 1Peter. And like I said, we're not really going to get into the text today. The next session we do will actually be covering verses 1 and 2. And hopefully from there on out, we'll get through with the introduction and get right into the kind of the meat of the epistle here. But the first thing I did to gather information was I used Logos. What Logos has is called a fact book, and I believe that's accessed through Tools. And yes, if you go to Tools, just click the Tools here and go into Reference, and you click Fact Book, and then you'll type in what you want here. I started to type in Epistle of 1Peter, but it automatically, you can see it's got a drop down, automatically put that in for me, and you see that it generates this report here. And you also notice too, these little arrows are not uncollapsed, they're not expanded, they're all collapsed. And if you keep them collapsed, it will generate much quicker for you. I would recommend that anytime you do any kind of report like that, that you keep it completely collapsed. And you can do that really just by right clicking on it, expand or copy, and then if you'll right click and collapse or however you want to do it. But I would recommend while it's loading to keep it collapsed. And in the fact book, you can find all kinds of interesting stuff. And the thing that we're interested in here is origin. And if you expand that, you'll see things like authorship, date, purpose. Let's see, you got background. You have recipients, but that's oftentimes up here in authorship and things like that. You see this more button here, you can hit this and it'll, anything that's in reference to the range that you put up here is going to be down here. Objects, canon, again, that's just the authenticity of the epistle. The meaning, where you have themes and theology and things like that, I would hold off on doing something like that until you've read the book through and you got a good handle and good grasp on it, and then check to see if what you're reading is right. You don't want to jump too far ahead simply because you're going to be depending on what somebody else is saying rather than what you're actually reading. So I would hold off on at least on the themes and meanings and things like that. But like I said, mainly what we're interested in is this up here. And so what I did was I created a notes document that just gives us a little bit of background about 1 Peter. And this is going to be pretty short today. I just kept it as simple and basic as I could. And when you're doing background, you may end up having a wealth of background resources. I have quite a few, and not just in Logos program. I actually have another Bible program that I use because I have some books in there that I don't have in Logos. But what I've done was I've narrowed it down to 3 or 4 of my favorite dictionaries and Bible background books. And so I didn't pull every single piece of information because I'm just after the basics. I just want to know the basics of this stuff. And the basics are, you have your date written. I just got three categories, just like in our right here in our fact book. Excuse me. I got authorship, date, and purpose, and that's really all I need to get started. You're going to come across some things later on in your study. There's a really cool book that kind of goes along with it. We'll get into that a little bit later on. I'm not going to jump into it right now, but whatever cultural concept you come across with, it'll have information for that. And so you always want to be aware of that, because cultural concepts and things about the culture are going to dictate how the book should be interpreted. And I mentioned context earlier, but what I forgot to mention was that there are different types of context. You have a passage context, you have a book context, you have authorial context, and really more importantly, you have cultural context. And cultural context is extremely important because oftentimes we'll read things and we won't realize what's actually being said if we're not aware of the culture. And I'll give you an example of this. From John chapter 4, we have Jesus with the woman at the well. And you notice you read in John that the woman at the well, when Jesus meets her, she's out during the heat of the day drawing water. And that may not seem significant to us, but John is giving information about the woman that you're not going to be aware of unless you're part of that culture. And this lady, obviously it's revealed later on that this lady was somewhat promiscuous. She had 5 husbands, and the one that she had living with now was not even her husband. And so it was customary for the women of the day to come out during either the morning hours and the cooler evening hours, the cooler part of the day, to draw water. Well, she was out during the heat of the day, probably because she was, considered an outcast. She was promiscuous. People looked down on her, and so she probably didn't even want to be around them, or they didn't want her around them. And so she came out during the heat of the day, rather than what the general custom time was for these women to come out and draw water. That's just part of a cultural concept, and really, without knowing that background, we might miss something. We might miss something important. So it's important to understand the cultural concept of something, especially the background of a book. Is there any type of cultural concept? And again, the passage guide is something that can actually help you out. And actually, you can get to a passage guide. Let me show you how to do that. You would just click on this, and you see I got 1 Peter 1:1 highlighted here, and you just pull up your passage guide. And once your passage guide comes up, you can kind of customize it. And I took 1 Peter 1:1 off, and I just did a whole entire book of 1 Peter. And so you'll notice here under this section, there's a section called Cultural Concepts. And if you expand this, you'll see a whole bunch of different things. You got age rules. That's a big one. You come down here, you see several. You see this more category, and you can kind of expand it. There's a whole bunch of them, so I'm not going to expand it all the way. But you have Christians as foreigners. You have the chosen people. Drunkenness. I believe there's one that's the role of wives to their husbands, which is also kind of a hot topic today. But anyway, these cultural concepts can help you understand the culture of that time, and particularly culture within the time of 1 Peter, when 1 Peter was written. But getting back to the background information, we're just going to go quickly over this. And the date written here, most people put it somewhere around about the dates of the year 63. And this, I got this from the Pulpit Commentary, and then here's one from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. It says AD 64, and almost every commentary that I looked at, or background book that I looked at to ascertain the date, we're right around the same ballpark. And so if it's right around the same ballpark, it's, just go with it. With 3 or 4. Again, there's no reason to look at 50 different books. Most of them are going to be in agreement. If you have something that's way off, like say some scholar says, well, we date this letter to be AD 90. Okay, well then you got a big gap there. You want to kind of research that a little bit more. But I typically I got about 4 favorite ones. I got the Bible Knowledge Commentary. I got Baker Encyclopedia. I got the Pulpit Commentary, and 1 or 2 others. And those are the ones that I normally use for as far as background information. But you see, I got things here in red, and those are things that I wanted to highlight so that I could kind of easily reference them when I needed them. And here you see it's 1 Peter was probably written before or shortly after the beginning of Nero's persecution of the church in AD 64. Some believe the church was not yet facing organized Roman persecution, and that's important, and they give evidence for that. When you read this, they talk about the government still being basically in place as far as the rights of all people back then, but Christians were socially unacceptable, and so it was more of a social type of persecution than it was an actual quote-unquote official persecution by the government. There it is right there, primarily a social and religious rather than a legal type, and that comes from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. Peter's writing them probably because greater persecution was imminent. He probably foresaw it. He assumes that his readers were going to go through this, and he wanted them to be prepared. Some of them, his readers were actually going through some type of a persecution. If you read the book thoroughly, we see that they were being accused of different things that they had not done. So Peter is kind of writing them and letting them know, hey, this is your life as a Christian. This is what it's supposed to be. This is what God has planned. But, God hasn't forgotten about you. It's not like God's forsaking you. And in fact, the command is not the command, but Peter tells them that in chapter 1, as a matter of fact, I think starting in verse 6, Peter tells them, you're going to rejoice. You're rejoicing now, even though you're in the midst of these trials and persecutions. You're rejoicing because you know that it's for the development and the purification of your faith. And so that's kind of the idea. Again, we said that suffering was a major theme, and also the glory that comes along with suffering is a major theme as well. So that really makes sense considering the full context of the book. And then you got the recipients. In verse 1, we're going to see that the recipients are different, I don't want to say countries, but provinces rather. You have Asia, Bithynia, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia. Peter names a whole bunch of different provinces, and they're people who are of the dispersion, the diaspora. And there's been some debate of whether that's been Jews or Gentiles, and you see here I got that in red. But there are several places that talk about a pagan background. For example, Peter says, and again, that's something I've bolded, the readers who were not a people of God are now a people of God. And that's a quote from Hosea, chapter 2. If you remember the book of Hosea, Hosea was commanded to marry a prophet. Hosea was commanded to marry a prostitute. Hosea was a prophet who was commanded to marry a prostitute. And he had children with her, and the children were illegitimate children. And so God tells Hosea, name the people, name these children, not my people, and name these children, not mercy. Once you were people, once you were far off. And he quotes Hosea to his readers here. and tells them that they were once in that same position, but now they're people of God. So that indicates that there were some Gentiles, and whether it was mainly Jewish or mainly Gentiles is not known. There are some commentators that believe that the majority of his audience, even if they were Gentiles, were more what they call the God-fearers, and God-fearers were Gentile people who almost converted to Judaism. I think they went as far as keeping the Mosaic law except for that of circumcision. I believe that if I read that correctly. And if I did not and somebody finds out, please correct me on that. I invite you to correct me on anything that I say wrong. But those were the recipients. My personal belief here is that they were both Jewish and Gentiles, or they were primarily Gentiles that were God-fearers. There were people who knew the Mosaic law, kept the Mosaic law, and so they were familiar with the Old Testament. Because there's some that are saying there had to be mainly Jews because Peter quotes so much of the Old Testament, and they quote so much of the sacrificial system and things like that. And they say that they had to be Jews in order to be familiar with that. But I disagree for other reasons. But then you have authorship last, and external evidence for the authenticity of the epistle, in other words, for Peter writing this, is very strong. And mainly down here you have, until relatively recent times, authenticity of the epistle's claim to apostolic authorship went unchallenged. And what that's all about is there are people saying that Peter was an unschooled, uneducated man, so he couldn't have written such polished Greek. However, it's clear in 1 Peter, the last chapter of 1 Peter, that 1 Peter tells his audience that he's writing by the hand of Silas. And it was customary for apostles and people who wrote letters back then to use a secretary, basically, is what it was in a sense, and to write their letters. And they would dictate the letter to the secretary, and the secretary would really just kind of polish it up and make it readable, because these letters were going to be read out loud. The majority of people didn't read and write then, and those who were trained scribes and trained in how language worked, or their language worked anyway, were the ones that were hired to write the letters. And so to say that the vocabulary is too high or it's too fancy in order for an unschooled fisherman to write is absolutely completely ignoring the cultural context, what we talked about before, of people using secretaries and other things to write these letters for them. And so I believe that Peter is the genuine author of 1 Peter. I believe that, again, even in his own words, he used Silas as his secretary. So I don't think there's any doubt or any reason to doubt that he is the author of this. And that basically covers our background information. Again, I didn't want to go into too much detail, but this is Logos, by the way, and this is a note file. And before I sign off, I'll show you how to get to the note file. If you need to make a note file, you simply come on to Documents here, and you come down to the Notes section, you click this, and it'll open up a notes file. And you can use it. If you need to use it as far as teaching, you would simply click this icon here, and you would hit Print Export, or you would just go to Command P, and it takes you, and you see I have 3 pages worth of notes, and you can click through and see how they're going to look. You can format them how you want. You have narrow margins, you have normal margins. You can put it in. You can copy your clipboard and paste it. You can save it as a PDF. All kinds of neat things you can do. And one of the things that I love about Logos is that it does a lot. This is a powerhouse sort of a Bible study program. So I use it consistently. I use it every day. And again, we're going to be using this as we walk through 1 Peter. I hope you have come back and join us for the next one. In the next session, we're actually going to be getting into 1 Peter. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2. So thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll join me again on the next session.